Here's a live look at counter-protesters getting underway in California, also New Orleans.
We have live team coverage right now. Steve Herrick is with the counter-protesters in Boston, but we begin with Molly Lyon, who's also live in Boston at the Boston Common. Molly?
On Tremont Street. This is one of the streets that just off of the Boston Common. You can see behind me there's still a huge crowd of people here. This is at least 100 people. Well, the counter-protest has dispersed, and the Boston Free Speech Rally, which drew speakers that the state and the city felt would be hateful, has also dispersed. This is a crowd that remains. We see a lot of signs here related to fascism. We spoke with the police, spoke with a couple of police officers on our way over here, and they described this crowd as sort of the leftovers. That the main crowd, the counter-protest, had largely dispersed. The other rally had dispersed, and these were folks that chose to stay behind. There were reports earlier today that they were throwing food at police officers, that there were some skirmishes that broke out over here. So this is what remains here on the streets of Boston after what was largely a peaceful day earlier. There were a few skirmishes, some shoving of police officers, some shoving through crowds as some of the rally goers or people that had differing views from the counter-protesters tried to make their way either on or through or off of the Boston Common. We witnessed a few folks that had some sort of Trump regalia on, perhaps a Trump flag or a Trump hat, were getting surrounded by members of the counter-protest who wanted to make their arguments against the president or against what they felt would be differing political views. But at this point, both of those rallies have dispersed, and here's where we stand now with this sort of situation on the street, literally here on the street in Boston. Police have been very prepared for this sort of thing throughout the day. Some 500 law enforcement officers were on hand to respond for both of these rallies and to respond to any sort of additional element, any miscreant element, or people that were coming here just to cause trouble. They didn't really care about the free speech rally. They didn't care about the counter-protest. They were here just to be part of the excitement and to potentially cause trouble. The street remains blocked here. There are still the large vehicles and the barricades at either end in an attempt to block any vehicles from coming through. We've seen the vehicle attacks most recently across in Europe and, of course, in Charlottesville. And police here in Boston were very aware of those potential situations, so they've really pulled out all the stops. So the police presence remains strong here. Melissa?
Thank you so much.
No problem. Go ahead.
Thanks, Molly. All right, with all the breaking news in Boston, the White House also making headlines today in the wake of another major shakeup in the staff. President Trump thanking Steve Bannon for his service a day after firing his controversial chief strategist. Bannon's departure marking the end of a turbulent 7-month tenure inside the administration, but also setting the stage for more waves outside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Rich Edson is live from Bridgewater, New Jersey, near the President's Golf Club in Bedminster. Rich.
Good afternoon, Melissa. And from Steve Bannon to Boston, President Trump has been very active on Twitter today here in central New Jersey, talking about all that's going on in Boston right now. He says, quote, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." He followed that up by saying, "Great job by all law enforcement officers and Boston Mayor Marty Walsh." The president began his day thanking Steve Bannon for his service over Twitter. Just a few days ago, it was Bannon who spoke to a liberal publication. The next day, we finally got the news that Steve Bannon was out at the White House. That was yesterday, and this was just a few weeks after John Kelly took over as chief of staff at the White House and wanted to do a review and an overhaul of the way things ran there. Steve Bannon, after leaving the White House, or the announcement came, took to the Weekly Standard, spoke with them, and in that interview he said, quote, "The Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over. We still have a huge movement, and we will make something of this Trump presidency, but that presidency is over. It'll be something else." Bannon's influence of the Trump administration's policy will now happen from outside the White House. He's back at Breitbart, where he started before the White House. In an interview we were talking about with that liberal publication, he knocked Trump administration to a certain degree foreign policy, in particular when it came to North Korea and China. He noted that we are at an economic war with China, and certainly there were some things that he said in that interview that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson pointed out that he didn't necessarily agree with, although the Secretary refused to comment specifically on what Bannon said. He certainly responded to the themes in there. Foreign policy now will continue without Steve Bannon. Yesterday at Camp David in Maryland, the president convened his national security team. It was there where they discussed Afghanistan policy. The president tweeting on that today. He said, quote, "It's an important day spent at Camp David with our very talented generals and military leaders. Many decisions made, including on Afghanistan." Now, as to what those decisions are, it's still unclear whether it has to do with troop levels, whether it has to do with the number or any introduction of contractors there. That is unclear as we await the White House and the president's official announcement on that. Back to you, Melissa.
Rich, can I just ask you, I mean, that part of the comment where Steve Bannon says that presidency, you know, that we won and we fought for, that part of the presidency is over, this is a different one. How are people interpreting that comment specifically?
Well, you know, they're interpreting it in some ways as a new phase in this White House, that there are powers within the White House. And I think that what the view from Steve Bannon and that wing is that since the inauguration, or even before when they were staffing up the White House, there are influences there that compete with the view that Steve Bannon set forth a year ago for this White House and that campaign, and that it somehow differs from what that is. And so, you know, he's talked about these globalists. He talked about them, quote, wedding themselves in that national prospect or American prospect piece. And when it comes to tariffs, when it comes to trade, when it comes to immigration, he's fought with people inside the White House over that. Now he's going to have to take that fight outside, a fight for the soul of this presidency that he was inside for and now out.
Rich Edson, you are so smart. You're a great reporter. Thank you. Love having you on.
Thanks, Wilson. Thanks a lot.
I'm sure he enjoyed that. He is a good reporter.
He is.
Meanwhile, in Boston, thousands of counter-protesters hit the streets today with a message of their own. Steve Harrigan joins me live now on the ground in Boston with more. And Steve, also a very good reporter. Steve, tell us what you've seen on the ground there today. You've been there since its inception.
They started about 11 o'clock in the morning and went for more than 3 hours. At its height, perhaps more than 15,000 counter-protesters were marching. They went 2 miles from Roxbury to Boston Common. There were real concerns in the run-up to this that there could be violence between the two sides. Boston police concerned, the mayor saying he didn't want the free speech movement here in Boston. If he had it his way, he wouldn't have allowed it. But that being the case, he made every preparation possible to try and prevent violence. We saw a heavy police presence out on the streets throughout the day, but the police initially in soft power mode. They were on bicycles. They were not wearing vests or helmets, so really just trying to keep the two sides apart for the most part. The numbers were dramatically different on both sides. 15,000 counter-protesters and as few as 50 of those right-wing protesters here. As about 20 arrests, there were some scuffles, and a couple of occasions riot police did have to step in, once on the street and a couple of times here in the park. In the park here, there was not the major confrontation people feared, but anyone really walking around with a Trump hat on was certainly putting themselves in danger of either being surrounded or attacked. That happened on at least a couple of occasions. The mayor's goal was to keep the two sides apart because of those huge disparity in numbers. That's largely what happened today. This afternoon, a lot of those counter-protesters have put their signs in the garbage, enjoying a nice afternoon here now in a park. Streets are back open. Things getting back to normal here in a hurry in Boston. Kelly, back to you.
Steve Harrigan, thank you very much. Steve, I hear a helicopter flying over. Is that for patrol?
There's still a heavy police presence on the street. Helicopters are over. They have been over throughout the day, both news and security copters. They have captured some footage of a few scuffles on the street, but with 15,000 people and the fears of what could have happened, certainly I think police are very happy with how things have worked out. Kelly?
Look, I don't want to keep you. We've got to go because we've got a panel code discussion. But earlier, Molly Lyon had reported that some of the counter-protesters were actually throwing food at the police officers. And I guess my question is, why?
I think there were some people here spoiling for a fight. We had a lot of protesters, men, women, children, older, younger, really calm and chanting, but a small group, perhaps fewer than 100, looking for a fight, doing worse than throwing food at police. Police even put out a note saying, don't throw urine at police, so attacking police with bottles with urine. So, I mean, that happens in Gitmo, and now it's happening on the streets of Boston. So some people spoiling for a fight, and they didn't get it here today.
All right, well, good for the police. police officers to resist that, but obviously probably having to make sure those people were kept in check. Steve Harrigan, always good to have your report, sir. Thank you for the update.
Let's bring in our panel now. Doug Schoen is a former advisor to President Clinton and a Fox News contributor. Evan Siegfried is a Republican strategist and author of GOP GPS. I actually want to start with the Steve Bannon issue, if you guys don't mind, because that reporter was just on with us, if you heard that. Doug, the question that I asked him, where Steve Bannon says on his way out, that presidency that we fought for, that we won, that presidency is over. How do you interpret that?
First, I say that's good, because we don't need a hard right sectarian presidency that seeks conflict and confrontation to pull back from our global commitments and to try to eviscerate the social safety net that we need and protect. We need an inclusive presidency that seeks to bring sides together to confront our adversaries and challenges both here and abroad.
Evan, how do you interpret that comment?
Well, I think that the presidency, every presidency, goes through different phases. And this is a new phase where the president can have this fresh start with people who have been critics of his and say, all right, you didn't want Steve Bannon. He's no longer here. Let's get about doing the business of the American people. Let's pass tax reform. Let's do infrastructure. Let's go and go full steam and make sure that we are actually doing a job that the American people are happy with and aren't stagnating like we did in the first 8 months of the current year.
But, Evan, part of the problem was always defining exactly what Steve Bannon's influence was and precisely what he stood for. It was so easy to call him a white supremacist. So many people said that, except for people who knew him and had worked with him and said that wasn't the case. I've never met him. I have no idea. But if you assume that, you know, now he's out, does the populism go with him? I mean, that seems to be so deeply ingrained in what the president himself actually cares about.
Well, first of all, Steve Bannon is not a white supremacist. I think that's been an unfair label that he's been tarnished with. But there are going to be people who are now going to say that Stephen Miller is the voice of the populism in the White House, and he's the white supremacist. Right. Stephen Miller's Jewish, so I don't think that really fits in with white supremacy. But I think that the president is going to have his fair share of critics from the left who will say that he does wrong no matter what he does. He could save a bus full of orphans, and they would say he did it only to get higher approval ratings.
Yeah. Doug, I mean, you say to renege on his global commitments. I don't know. I mean, the president has been more active in terms of where we need to get involved and what needs to be done than anyone expected. So, and that was with Steve Bannon there. So,
well, Steve Bannon wanted to pull back. He was against any possible involvement on the Korean Peninsula, anything in Europe. Steve Bannon was basically anti-globalist.
It was, but it didn't seem like the president was listening to him on that front.
Well, you know, we don't need the chief strategist for the President of the United States to be somebody articulating a isolationist message. Thank goodness the president is talking today at Camp David about how we can renew and reassert our commitment in Afghanistan. We have to confront an assertive Iran, obviously North Korea, the Russians in Europe and the Middle East. So we have huge, huge challenges. You're right, Melissa. Our president hasn't been listening. He's best to listen to his generals, to General McMaster, to General Mattis especially.
Evan, you know, I mean, what does this mean about his support outside the White House and his base? President Trump has obviously a very loyal and a very fervent base. At the same time, Steve Bannon has, you know, controlled through Breitbart a large number of people in the narrative in a great sense, and has proved himself to be a media mastermind. Does he start working against the president, do you think?
Well, everybody thought that because Steve Bannon was fired from the White House that he was going to go out and go nuclear and attack President Trump, but that he's signaling he's going to do everything opposite. He actually is more dangerous out of the White House, helming Breitbart, which MIT just did a study that showed it's one of the most influential news networks in the country, if not the world. because of what it digs up and how it pushes the conversation nationally. And I think Steve Bannon, he is very smart, and he knows how to work Breitbart to get things out there. Remember what happened. He mainstreamed all of Hillary Clinton's problems in 2016 before he joined the Trump campaign by having the New York Times release the damaging factual information about how Hillary Clinton had been engaging in pay-to-play. Steve Bannon is
How did he mastermind the New York Times releasing that information?
He was helping to write Clinton Cash through his organization in Florida, and that and the research they found that was in Peter Schweizer's book Clinton Cash, just before the book came out, Steve Bannon made sure that the information was passed to the New York Times. The New York Times was reporting it, which is much more trusted among liberals than it is among, or than, say, Breitbart. And when liberals are hearing from the New York Times something about how Clinton was engaged in pay-to-play, it was extremely damaging to her, and it helped stop her from winning the election.
Doug, what's your bet? I mean, does he really help the president's case from outside the White House, or do you think that he's going to be, you know, sort of irritated and disenfranchised, maybe a little bit of vengeance mixed in there?
Yeah, that's what I think, Melissa, sadly, and I think Evan's right. He's much more dangerous from the outside than from the inside. I'm told he's going to war. He said that, I think, to Bloomberg yesterday. Goodness gracious, we don't need people going to war, whether he goes to war with Matt Drudge, with globalists. You know, my attitude is we've got real problems. We've got real enemies. We can't fight among ourselves. We need to move past these divisions. Look, I'm against white supremacy. I'm Jewish. I find Nazism abhorrent.
I think everyone does.
I think you're exactly right. But more important, stop the fighting, stop the polarization, focus on what makes us unique and great as Americans, freedom and liberty and free speech.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Melissa.
So a lot going on today. Today's events in Boston come just 1 week after the deadly violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, and reigniting a national debate over Confederate monuments and their place here in America. We will discuss that ahead. Plus, Spanish authorities expanding their search for the driver behind this week's deadly terror attack in Barcelona. The very latest, still ahead. Fox News Alert. 3 days of mourning declared in Spain after the terror attacks there left 14 people dead and more than 100 others injured. Now authorities are expanding their search across international borders for the driver who steered his van right into a crowd of pedestrians in the heart of Barcelona, killing 13 people. Benjamin Hall is live from Barcelona with the very latest. Benjamin?
Yeah, hi, Kelly. I mean, the government certainly have stepped up security here in Barcelona as well as we hear around Spain itself. And that's because this new information has come out that the driver of that white van that killed 13 people here on Las Ramblas on Thursday is still at large. Now, police thought that they had killed him in a shootout on Friday, but that turned out to be another terrorist. And so now they have named the new driver. His name is Yunus Abu Yaqub. He's a 22-year-old Moroccan. He is thought to be the potential ringleader of this cell. And so manhunt now underway for him. Abu Yaqub came from a small village just outside Barcelona called Ricols, and that has now become a focus of this investigation. It's believed it may have been the epicenter of the plot itself, where the plot was forged. And actually they are looking also for the imam of the local mosque there. They fear that he may have been the man who radicalized these people. They also think that that imam may have died in the explosion which took place on Wednesday. Meanwhile, new footage has come out of the attack itself here on Las Ramblas, and you can see from security footage inside a museum just how close that van came to knocking over strollers, and it's a reminder of how indiscriminate the attack really was. And of course that reminds us of the victims themselves, and we're learning more information about them. A 3-year-old boy, a 74-year-old lady, and also the American, a 42-year-old by the name of Jared Tucker from California, and he was here celebrating his first wedding anniversary with his wife. So tragedy all round, this community trying to come to terms with it, really picking itself up, but it's a reminder that this country is very much still on high alert. There's also fears that this new driver who they're hunting for may have crossed into France. They know that one of the terrorists rented a van. They haven't tracked that down, so border security also increased. So it's been a tragic few days here, and this is by no means over. Spanish authorities do say that they have broken this terror cell, and they've decided not to raise the alert level to level 5, the highest. They don't believe there's an imminent threat, but this story by no means over until that man is captured. Kelly?
Benjamin, it's important to note real quickly where you're standing there. There is a crowd of people who have returned. The people of Barcelona obviously showing their resolve that they're not going to cower to any terrorists.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and within 24 hours after the attack, this major street, Las Ramblas, was open again, and we are seeing people pour out. There are memorials and candles and flowers up and down it, and there is a real sense that this attack will not cow the people of the city, that they will not be defeated by the terrorists. So yes, they are coming out in force to remember the dead, but you know, still you can feel the sadness here. And Donald Trump also reaching out today to the Prime Minister of Spain, Rajoy, offering his condolences too. So condolences from around the world after this tragic event.
Very much so. Benjamin Hall, a lot of people obviously were appreciating the president reaching out to them, but we appreciate your report too, sir. Thank you.
So the White House keeping a close eye on Spain in the wake of deadly terror attacks. It is the largest foreign policy challenge for the Trump administration as it monitors tensions on the Korean Peninsula with U.S. and South Korea joint military drills beginning this week and the ongoing political turmoil in Venezuela. Let's bring in James Carafano. He is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a security and foreign policy analyst. Boy, a lot to work on here. Let's start with those terror attacks. What do you make of them? What do you make of the fact that they are still searching for one of the major players?
Well, you know, predictable. We have a great analyst at Heritage named Rahman Sibcock. So every Islamist terror attack in Europe since 2001, and there have been more in the last 2 years than there were between 2001 and 2014. So what accounts for this surge? Huge radicalized populations in Europe. You overflood to that, bringing in millions of people that you can't vet and account for. So the Europeans really have a big problem, and you know all the courage and everything for people out in the street saying we're going to go on and live our lives. But what defeats this in the end is good CT programs, and Europe is lacking those.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you see now that we're learning the number of people that were involved, the explosion that happened at Wednesday night that now people think, or police officials think, could have been some sort of bomb-making factory, and then moving to even a third location. Now you have one of the terrorists who they believe is the leader of the group, or at least the driver in the car, can't find him. I mean, what does this tell you about the level of sophistication, and do you think that they were trained elsewhere or guided by forces elsewhere?
Well, we'll know soon enough, because typically in these cases, authorities come up with a lot of evidence after the fact. But here's what we think is as ISIS lost its territory in the Middle East, the global Islamist insurgency really felt the impetus that they have to promote attacks to make them still relevant. So, I mean, I think there is an argument to be made that this is part of that campaign to show that ISIS and groups like that are still in the fight. So I think we can expect more of this until these kind of networks are rolled up.
Yeah. Let me turn your attention to the situation in North Korea, which, of course, was our front page story before all of these various things happened. To some extent, some piece of it has, at least the temperature has been turned down slightly, in the sense that the Kim regime has said that, for now they won't target Guam. But beyond that, it's unclear what really happens from here. What do you think?
Right. So these are two very different kinds of stories. In Europe, we have a problem that the Europeans can't handle and is really growing. They don't have a good solution for, which in part why the president put in the temporary ban, so we wouldn't be importing those kind of problems here. This is a different kind of story in North Korea. There are big steps in the escalatory ladder. There's not a lot of room for anybody to really ramp this up. So I never thought that this crisis was going to spin out of control. What's noteworthy, though, is we have these U.S. ROC exercises coming up, and the North Koreans might not just want to stand by and watch them, so they may do something else. My guess is they might do something at a lower level, artillery exchange, some other kind of thing. So don't expect it to go unmarked by the North Koreans, but again, don't expect it to lead to some kind of rapid escalation.
But we heard a lot of people try and make the cases, and Rice among them, that this is the best we can hope for. That this sort of going down the path where he's not being explicitly aggressive, but is still ramping up, testing, continuing to develop, continuing to hoard weapons, that this is the best case scenario. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, yeah, but you have to look at it from the U.S. perspective.
Yes, you
do? Well, what are our real interests here? One is that there's no war in Northeast Asia because that's bad for everybody. And the other is that Kim doesn't have the capacity to attack the United States. We can achieve both those goals without either changing the regime or starting World War III. Okay, so between nuclear, conventional deterrence, and missile defense, we can check any nuclear threat against the United States. We can check any escalation from mid or lower level. And the heavy containment will work because the sanctions are going to really limit the capacity of them to really build out their inventory, so they're a significant military threat.
But they were already reporting that they already have the ability to reach parts of the U.S. I mean, if they have that miniaturized nuclear warhead, they have an ICBM, you don't think they're a threat already?
No, because those missiles aren't going to get here because, one, we're going to shoot them down. Two, they have very limited capability. And three, we have a nuclear deterrent. Remember, the only purpose of this regime wanting nuclear weapons is to sustain the regime. And the one thing they know that will eliminate the regime in a New York minute is if they start a war. So we can defend our interests in this region, and I think this administration is actually onto that policy. This is actually one of the crises in the world that I think they've done well, and I actually think we've got a good handle on it.
Yeah, I disagree, but we're out of time. We'll have to pick it up another time. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate your time.
We are awaiting an update from the Boston Police Department after a day of massive protests through the streets of that city. Also, fresh developments on the showdown over Confederate monuments in the South. That's all next.
Fox News alert, we are awaiting a Boston Police Department update after a conservative free speech rally in Boston ends peacefully for the most part as thousands of people gather in Boston Common with counter-protesters also in the streets. Boston police tweeting that some protesters threw rocks at officers. They are asking individuals to refrain from throwing urine. That would be nice. And other harmful projectiles at officers. Similar events were held in cities across the country as a debate heats up over Confederate monuments. Brian Yennis has more on that story. Brian.
Hi, Melissa. Well, we are now watching protests in Houston and New Orleans around the country, and obviously this is all circled around, at least the genesis for a lot of this is the Confederate monuments and statues around the country, which has served as a genesis for conversations and debates regarding race and inclusiveness and really history as well. And right now, protesters are gathered at City Hall in New Orleans, pushing for city leaders to remove additional Confederate statues in the city. The city had already removed 4 Confederate monuments before Charlottesville, and just this morning, Duke University removed a carved limestone statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from the entrance of the university's chapel. The statue was vandalized on Wednesday. In a letter, Duke's president, Vincent Price, said, quote, "I took this course of action to protect Duke Chapel to ensure the vital safety of students and community members who worship there, and above all to express the deep and abiding values of our university. The removal also presents an opportunity for us to learn and heal. The statue will be preserved so that students can study Duke's complex past and take part in a more inclusive future." And just yesterday, the mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, Mike Signer, said he wants the statue of Confederate Robert E. Lee removed immediately. Earlier this year, the mayor had voted to keep the monument, but that's since changed after the violence there last week led to the death of Heather Heyer. The mayor saying, quote, that for the sake of public safety, public reassurance, to magnify Heather's voice and to repudiate the pure evil that visited us here, I am calling today for the removal of these Confederate statues from downtown Charlottesville. Interestingly enough, a new poll released this week shows 62% of Americans are for keeping Confederate monuments in place. 27% say they are for removing them, and 11% are unsure. And obviously we know, based on tweets this week from the president, he is for keeping these statues, saying that it would be, quote, foolish to remove them and that they are, quote, beautiful. Melissa.
Brian Yennis, thank you.
Counter-protesters now clearing the streets in Boston after a mostly peaceful demonstration taking place there today in response to a conservative free speech rally. We are, I should point out, awaiting a news conference from the police there. Let's bring in Jordan Fabian, White House correspondent for The Hill. Jordan, as we await that news conference to begin, tell me, if you will, how all of this might impact. Well, first, let's talk about the Boston protest today and what you saw and your response to that. I'm sorry, it looks like we're having the news conference right now. Jordan. We'll break into that, and then we'll come back to you later.
And
Let's listen.
It's important that today in our city, there's been a lot of work done to be able to come in and to be able to protest, to be able to express themselves all the way from Roxbury Community College.